the morning of January 11th, 1923, broke over the Ruhr Valley, not with the roar of industry, but with the rhythmic, metallic clatter of hobnailed boots. Imagine the visual contrast, stark and terrifying. On one side, you have the French 32nd Infantry Corps, accompanied by Belgian allies, marching into Essen. They are the victors of the Great War. Clad in horizon blue coats, bayonets fixed, projecting the ultimate image of hard power. They are here to execute the world's most aggressive foreclosure. In the mind of French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré, this is a simple transaction. Germany refused to pay its war reparations in gold and timber, so France would take it in coal and steel. It was supposed to be a seizure of assets, a logistical checkmate. But as the French cavalry trotted past the towering smokestacks of the Krupp steelworks, they were met with something unsettling. Not gunfire, not trenches, but silence. The chaotic hum of Europe's industrial heart stopped dead. This was the Ruhrkampf, the struggle for the Ruhr. In a coordinated act of passive resistance, German workers downed their tools, railway switchmen abandoned their posts, and telegraph operators left their lines dead. The French generals, masters of trench warfare and artillery barrages, suddenly found themselves standing in the middle of the world's most complex industrial machine, watching it rust before their eyes. They had the guns to occupy the mines, but they could not force a sullen miner to dig, nor could a bayonet make a steam engine run. This brings us to the central paradox of our story. You can conquer a territory, but you cannot conquer an economy. While French soldiers shivered in the damp German winter, guarding silent coal piles that they couldn't move, a far deadlier war was beginning in Berlin. To pay the wages of these striking workers, to subsidize a nation that had stopped working. The German government made a fatal calculation. They didn't have gold. They didn't have tax revenue. So they turned to the only weapon they had left, the printing press. What looked like a French military triumph on the surface was actually the trigger for a suicidal economic implosion. This wasn't just a border dispute. It was the moment the 20th century learned a brutal lesson in the physics of power. It was the moment a nation chose to murder its own currency to save its sovereignty, dragging the creditor, the debtor, and the innocent middle class into an abyss of zeros. This is not just the story of an occupation. It is the autopsy of how the search for security destroyed the concept of money itself. To understand why rational men chose this path of mutual destruction, we must leave the frozen rail yards of Essen and step into the smoke-filled, overheated offices of Paris and Berlin. In Paris, Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré was a man backed into a corner, fighting a war that had supposedly ended 4 years prior. History often paints him as a vindictive Shylock demanding his pound of flesh, but the reality was far more desperate. France was technically victorious, but financially bankrupt. The northern third of the country lay in ruins, and the bill for reconstruction was astronomical. To make matters worse, France's wartime allies, Britain and the United States, had turned cold. Wall Street banks were demanding repayment of war loans, indifferent to France's suffering. Poincaré stared at a ledger that simply did not balance. His political survival hinged on a single, dangerous promise made to the Yais for French electorate. Le Boche payera. The German will pay. If he failed to extract gold from Berlin, his government would fall, and the French economy might collapse under the weight of American debt. For Poincaré, the invasion wasn't an act of aggression. It was a desperate liquidity run. Across the border in Berlin, the atmosphere was not one of calculation, but of paralysis. The Weimar Republic was a fragile creature. a democracy born in defeat and hated by its own people. Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, a shipping magnate with zero political instinct, sat on a throne of bayonets. Kuno was trapped in a lethal vice. On his right, ultra-nationalists and the Freikorps were assassinating politicians who dared to collaborate with the enemy. Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau had been gunned down just months prior for merely negotiating. On his left, communists were stockpiling weapons for a revolution. If Kuno paid the French, the nationalists would overthrow him. If he refused and the economy crashed, the communists would rise. So, Kuno chose the only card he had left. Katastrophenpolitik, the politics of catastrophe. He gambled on a strategy of calculated weakness. By proving to the world that Germany was utterly broken, he hoped to force the British and Americans to intervene and restrain France. The chessboard was set with a cruel geometry. The Ruhr wasn't just territory. It was the jugular vein of the German body, pumping 80% of the nation's steel and coal. France needed to squeeze that vein to survive. Germany needed to sever it to prove a point. Both leaders were playing a game of chicken with the global economy, driven not by strength, but by profound domestic weakness. They were two drowning men, clutching at each other, dragging the continent down with them. With the political stage set, France initiated the actual mechanism of extraction. They didn't just send soldiers. They sent a bureaucratic weapon known as MICOM, Mission Interalliée de Contrôle des Usines et des Mines. This was an army of French and Belgian engineers, tasked with a seemingly impossible objective: to hijack the complex nervous system of German industry and bypass the German state entirely. The plan was a brute force transaction. If Berlin wouldn't write the check, MICOM would seize the collateral directly, coal, coke, and timber, and ship it back to French furnaces. They commandeered the railways, the customs houses, and the mine heads. It was an attempt to impose Bayonet Capitalism, operating under the delusion that a modern industrial economy could be run by decree. It was a disaster of logistics. The French quickly discovered that you cannot extract value from a hostile system at gunpoint. When French engineers tried to operate the captured trains, they found the signals disabled, the switches sabotaged, and the blueprints vanished. When they tried to move coal barges down the Rhine, they found the vessels sunk or the crews missing. The German resistance wasn't just passive. It was technically precise. It was a bureaucratic guerrilla war. The cost of this forced transaction became absurd. France was spending millions of francs a day to feed, house, and protect an occupation force of 100,000 men, only to extract a fraction of the coal they had received for free under the previous reparations agreement. The transaction costs exceeded the value of the assets seized. France was effectively paying a premium to rob a bank that was already empty. But amidst this deadlock, a darker transaction was taking place in the shadows. While the French soldiers froze and the German government printed worthless paper, the German industrial tycoons, the coal barons, led by figures like Hugo Stinnes, saw an opportunity. Stinnes, the king of the Ruhr, understood the mechanics of the chaos better than anyone. While the state crumbled, he used his access to foreign currency and hard assets, coal and steel, to buy up smaller competitors who were drowning in inflation. He played a double game, publicly supporting the patriotic resistance, while privately consolidating an empire on the cheap. The occupation, which was destroying the German middle class and bleeding the French treasury, was essentially a massive wealth transfer into the hands of a few industrial oligarchs. The hard assets weren't going to Paris. They were being concentrated in the hands of a private monopoly, hidden behind the fog of nationalistic fervor. The battlefield now shifted from the coal pits of the Ruhr to the printing presses of Berlin. This was where the true structural trap snapped shut. To sustain the passive resistance, to pay millions of workers to not work, the German government needed vast sums of money. But the occupation had severed the state's primary source of tax revenue. With the Ruhr cut off, the treasury was empty. A rational government might have surrendered. Instead, the Weimar Republic chose to engineer its own reality. They turned on the printing presses at the Reichsbank, running them 24 hours a day, driven by the desperate logic that paper could substitute for production. It created a feedback loop of terrifying perfection. As the government flooded the market with fresh marks to pay the striking miners, the value of the currency naturally dipped. This meant the cost of the next week's wages was higher, requiring more printing. The snake began to eat its own tail. But the trap was not merely accidental. For some, it was a weapon. The internal enemy was the structural weakness of the German tax system itself. Taxes were assessed on past income, often with a lag of months or years. By the time the government collected taxes, the inflation had rendered the money worthless. A tax bill assessed in January might be worth a fleet of cars. By the time it was paid in July, it couldn't buy a newspaper. The state was effectively liquidating itself. Meanwhile, the trap ensnared the French as well. Poincaré had assumed that German economic pain would translate into French gain. He was wrong. The collapse of the mark infected the European financial system like a contagion. International speculators, sensing the weakness of the entire continental structure, launched a bear raid, not just against the mark, but against the French franc. France found that by destroying its debtor, it was destroying its own credit rating. The markets realized that a bankrupt Germany could never pay reparations, and a France without reparations was insolvent. The system had become a suicide pact. The German government was burning its own house down to smoke out the invader, while the invader was locked inside, unable to leave without losing face, choking on the smoke. The trap was the realization that in a modern, interconnected economy, there is no such thing as an isolated collapse. The financial levees broke and the floodwaters began to rise, not just over the poor, but over the very concept of value itself. The collapse, when it finally arrived, did not look like a graph. It looked like madness. By the autumn of 1923, the velocity of money had surpassed the speed of human thought. The psychological anchor of value vanished completely. It was no longer about inflation. It was the annihilation of time. A factory worker would be paid at 11 a.m. and had to sprint to the bakery, because by 12:80 p.m., his wheelbarrow of cash would have lost 30% of its purchasing power. Waiters in cafes climbed onto tables every 30 minutes to announce new prices. A cup of coffee ordered at 5,000 marks cost 8,000 by the time it was sipped. The currency became a hot coal. You had to drop it the instant you touched it. This economic vertigo triggered a specific medical phenomenon that German physicians termed the zero stroke, Nullenschlag. Ordinary people, exhausted by the mental gymnastics of calculating billions and trillions for a loaf of bread, suffered nervous breakdowns. They were found wandering the streets, staring blankly, compulsively writing endless strings of zeros on napkins and walls. The ledger of society had broken. As the currency evaporated, so did the social contract. The domino effect moved swiftly from the wallet to the gun. Hunger stripped away the veneer of civilization. Farmers formed armed militias to defend their potato fields from starving city dwellers who swarmed the countryside like locusts. In the cities, the police, paid in worthless paper, turned a blind eye to looting or joined in. It was in this vacuum of authority that the political shocks detonated. The government in Berlin finally accepted the inevitable. They could not win. In late September, Chancellor Stresemann called off the passive resistance. To the nationalists, this was not a pragmatic economic decision. It was treason. The backlash was immediate. In Munich, a fringe agitator named Adolf Hitler, sensing the visceral rage of a humiliated nation, decided the time was right. On November 8th, amidst the peak of the hyperinflation chaos, he fired a pistol into the ceiling of a beer hall, launching the failed putsch that would nonetheless sow the seeds of the future. The collapse was total. Germany had effectively returned to a barter economy. The middle class, the teachers, the pensioners, the civil servants who believed in saving and order, was wiped out. Their life savings, the fruit of decades of labor, couldn't buy a tram ticket. The French had occupied the Ruhr to get paid, but in doing so, they had inadvertently broke the spine of German democracy, leaving a paralyzed nation vulnerable to the monsters waiting in the wings. By August 1925, the last French battalions marched out of the Ruhr Valley. They left as they had arrived, in orderly columns, with their banners flying. But the silence they left behind was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. When the smoke cleared and the accountants finally sat down to perform the final audit, the results were a study in irony. France, the supposed victor, had achieved a textbook definition of a Pyrrhic victory. Poincaré's hard power gamble had failed. The cost of the occupation had nearly bankrupted the French treasury and shattered the value of the franc. They had marched in to demand reparations, but ended up needing a bailout themselves. The bayonet had proven to be a terrible tool for mining coal. Germany, conversely, had survived, but at a cost that defied calculation. The miracle of the Rentenmark eventually stopped the inflation, resetting the dials of the economy. But you cannot reset the human mind. The German middle class, the pillar of stability, the people who believed in rules, savings, and order, had been liquidated. They learned a lesson that would haunt the 20th century, that following the rules leads to destitution, while ruthlessness leads to survival. The psychological trauma of 1923 did not disappear. It festered, waiting for a demagogue to weaponize their resentment a decade later. So, who was the true winner of this European suicide pact? The winner was not in Paris, nor in Berlin. The winner wore a suit, not a uniform, and sat in an office in New York. The impasse was finally broken not by generals, but by American bankers via the Dawes Plan, 1924. The United States stepped in as the global creditor of last resort, lending money to Germany so Germany could pay France, so France could pay the United States. The triangle of debt was closed, but the center of gravity had shifted. Europe had lost its financial sovereignty to Wall Street. The occupation of the Ruhr marked the definitive end of European supremacy and the beginning of the American century. The final philosophy. The tragedy of the Ruhr is a timeless lesson on the limits of force. It proved that in a modern, interconnected economy, sovereignty is not defended by borders, but by solvency. France learned that you cannot extract value from a system you are actively destroying. Germany learned that a nation can print money, but it cannot print value. In the end, the occupation was a transaction where everyone lost, but the ledger remained open. The debt of 1923 was not paid in gold. It was refinanced, compounded with interest, and eventually paid in blood. 10 years later, on the battlefields of World War II.